We're in the 6th week of an interactive study on the book of Revelation. This time we're going to look at chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15. This is the third cycle of 7 visions. It consists primarily of key symbols, which are characters and the role that they play. We're going to take a look at the woman, the child, the dragon, the beast, the false prophet, the 144,000, the angelic announcers, and the Son of Man, which we all know is Jesus. Just like the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets, these visions lead up to the vision of the second coming. The 2 preceding cycles have focused on judgment issuing from God's throne. This particular cycle depicts the depth, the nature of the spiritual conflict. Characters appear in symbolic form to represent the forces of the 2 sides of the cosmic spiritual war. Revelation chapter 12 is an apocalyptic Christmas story with a beautifully clothed woman and a male child. But this one has a fiery red dragon ready to devour the child as soon as he's born. This is not the nativity scene that you grew up with. But this one gives you a peek behind the curtain to see the struggle between God and the forces that work against him. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, a great sign, and we're going to look at 7 signs. This is the first one. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 thorns on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign, this is the second sign, appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his head. This is a valuable overview that provides the history stretching from the times before human beings existed just up until Christ's return. As we're going to see, these figures symbolize the major spiritual forces that have been at work for several thousand years. In order to understand these 2 chapters, we need to understand the symbols. What do the woman, the male child, and the dragon represent? The woman is the nation of Israel that was chosen by God to bring forth the Messiah. The promised child, or the male child, would come to earth, restore the relationships that were broken, and die on the cross, conquer death, be raised from the dead, and then be raised up to God. In this book, we know him as the slain lamb. If we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, we get to see how this picture unfolds. The evil one deceives Adam and Eve, and then God gives them this warning and tells them that this is what's going to happen. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike your heel. All the way back in Genesis, this whole thing started. The Bible reveals the existence of evil, and that evil is called the dragon. We know him better as Satan or as the devil. What we do know and what we learn about him from this particular text is he is a liar and he's a murderer. It's also what John tells us in his gospel in chapter 8, verse 44. He wants to kill, steal, destroy God's people. He has been given incredible power, but his power is limited. The evil one tried to prevent the Messiah from ever being born. He was moved to have Cain kill Abel, Pharaoh to kill the Hebrew boys, Saul to try to kill David, Haman to try to eliminate all the Jews in the time of Esther, and then Herod tried to kill all the boys under 2 just before Jesus was born. Let's see what happens. In verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, quoting Psalm chapter 2. And her child was snatched up to God in his throne. It's interesting how the entire life, death, ministry of Jesus is summed up in one simple sentence. And her child was snatched up to God in his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her, for God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. This was war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough. They lost their place in heaven. The evil one was cast out of heaven. He was hurled down, the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. We have to make sure we capture exactly what this evil one is doing, which is about deception. The birth of Christ declared the death of the ancient serpent. The dragon was hurled to earth to deceive the nations and accuse the believers. When he could not keep the child from being born, he tried to get Jesus off of his mission. The death of Christ, defying the adversary. He cannot force people to make wrong choices. This is important that we understand this. Satan can influence behavior by stirring up thoughts and emotions through subtle manipulation. He appeals to man's natural inclination and provokes people to devise and commit evil. We saw this taking place in our city a couple weeks ago. he devises that and he convinces them that it's good. Such was the case with Adam and Eve. Satan's deception led them to question what God had told them when he told them that they could eat of any tree except for the forbidden one. Adam and Eve set in motion a pattern of rebellious attitudes and choices that separated them and us from our Creator. Sin has tainted their relationships. They chose to decide for themselves who got the ability to choose what was right or wrong. Now we're going to slow down and capture what's really important. If we go down to chapter 12, verse 11. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. The way that we are able to conquer the deceiver and the accuser is by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. They did not love their life so much as to shrink back from death. That is so cool and so powerful. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. The resurrection of Christ demolished all of Satan's ability to accuse us. It is right that we're guilty, but because what Jesus did on the cross, we do not have to be held accountable to that. In chapter 12, verse 17, I'm going to skip down. After the unsuccessful attempts to kill the Messiah, the dragon's anger was turned towards the people of God, especially the righteous remnant of the nation of Israel. He is now he's known as the accuser and the deceiver. He has two strategies: to accuse the saints and deceive the nations into thinking that Israel and the church are dangerous. This explains why you have seen so much anti-Semitism in the world and you get to see growing opposition against the church. Verse 17 says it perfectly. Satan was furious with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring. He continues by describing what he hates. Let's catch this. He despises those who keep the commandments of God and hold true to the testimony of Jesus. The evil one does everything he can to persecute, to make miserable people who keep the commands of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. The Holy Spirit and the believers are the only one restraining them from evil. And if it wasn't for the Spirit and it wasn't for believers, they would have free reign on the earth. According to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3 through 4, the devil is the god of this world who blinds the minds of unbelievers. He currently rules this earth and has been responsible for deceiving the world. Luke chapter 4, verse 6, John chapter 14, verse 30. Now, we're going to get introduced to the evil one and his minions in chapter 13. The dragon stood on the sea of the shore. This is the third sign. And I saw, this is the third sign, a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on its horns. This is quoting from Daniel chapter 7. And each held a blasphemous name. Also Ezekiel chapter 37 and 38. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mountain like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and his great authority. One of his heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound would be healed. I want you to capture this, that Satan's primary strategy is deception. He is a counterfeiter, and all he can do is counterfeit what God does. The whole world was filled with his wonder and that followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and he also worshiped the beast and asked, "Who is this beast? Who can wage war like him?" The beast was given a mouth to utter. And remember earlier, a few weeks ago, I asked you to underline every time you see given, was given, permission, and authority. And what we're knowing and what we get to see is that only because God permitted the evil one to attack believers that they get to carry it out. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those that live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against the holy people and to conquer them. God allowed them to happen. It was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. And all the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. And remember, the inhabitants of the earth are the earth dwellers, or the people that have given their allegiance to this world, not the world to come. All those whose names were not written in the book, the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Satan works through government. that function as divine authority instead of under divine authority. In Romans chapter 13, we're called to obey our government. But whenever the government usurps its authority and instead of taking the place that it should be under God, and it becomes to where they think that they are God, that causes trouble. Whenever a government functions as divine authority instead of under divine authority, there's problems. Is this beast a physical person, a particular empire, an evil spirit behind earthly systems? God permits the beast to curse his name, crush his people, control the nation. Satan deceives people through the teachers who look like friends but sound like enemies. These people of God will suffer under Satan's wrath. The cost will become greater and greater. There are two sides on this conflict. One side, you'll find the dragon and his minions. The other side, you'll find the Lamb and his army. In chapter 13, we're introduced to his minions. The first beast comes from the sea, and the monstrous mixture of his features show that this beast has power and ferocity. There is something repulsive about this beast. The dragon carries out his rage against God's people. A picture of how he carries out his strategy. Who is the beast? First century believers would have understood this as a state-run government that was persecuting believers and making them worship the emperor. Some people are convinced that the two beasts represent demonized state powers that demand worship and conformity, and others believe that they're two literal people known as the Antichrist and the false prophet. John mentions an Antichrist in his letters. He says that there will be a series of leaders building up to the lawless one that will bring destruction. I believe that there have been governments, leaders, systems, and structures that have persecuted the people of God throughout history, but that does not rule out the fact that there will be a literal person. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 9, we read these words. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. If anyone goes into captivity he'll go. If anyone is killed with the sword, he will be killed with the sword. And this is the part I want us to pay attention to. This calls for patient endurance on behalf of the saints. This calls for patient endurance on behalf of the saints. God tells us directly what we need to do. You might get captured. You might get killed. And God wants you to remain faithful anyway. As we focus on the 7 characters, there are a couple truths that are abundantly clear. And the first one I want to catch is there is a war, and you need to decide which side you're on. There is a war going on in this cosmos, and we have to decide which side of the war we're going to go on. Revelation shows that history involves spiritual war, and the war, there are two sides. You're either for God or you're against him. You either serve God in one way or another, or you will be found worshiping idols and giving your allegiance to the forces of evil. Revelation implicitly implies and issues a challenge just like Joshua did. The single most important decision that you will ever make is who you decide to give your worship, who you decide to give your allegiance. Every heart has an object of worship. There is no exceptions. The single choice will determine the course of your life, the level of the satisfaction that you get to experience, and the ultimate destination of where you end up. Which side will you be on? It will be costly to follow Christ in this world. But don't compromise, even if it means you're being made fun of. Hold fast to your faith. Even if it means you lose your job and all your money, hold fast to your faith. Even if it means you get ridiculed and you face oppression and isolation, imprisonment, and even death. Follow the Lamb, and one day you will stand with him, sing with him. One day you will be satisfied in him. And if you decide to follow the Lamb, it will be worth it. Satan is an imitator and a counterfeiter, and he seeks to control people through deception. We're going to continue to the second beast, or the foresign. Then I saw a second beast coming out of, and he had 2 horns, and he exercised authority. And I'm going to skip down here. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that that image could speak. He imitates what God does, just like God had the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There is the Antichrist, the false prophet, and Satan himself, and all they do is imitate what God's people do. In verse 16, and it also forced all the people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands and on their foreheads, so they could not buy and sell unless they had the mark, which is his name, and the number of the beast on his name. Satan is an imitator and a counterfeiter, and he seeks to control people through deception. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the image that has captured the imagination of people's attention throughout the centuries. The mark of the beast is a sign of ownership, loyalty, and identification with the beast that people will need in order to buy or sell. The mark will either be placed on their right hand or on their foreheads. Some people believe that a diabolical leader will gain power through peace and deception and will control oppressive governments and demand allegiance. The Antichrist will force everyone to receive something like microchips in their right hands and in their foreheads, and it will work like barcodes and will replace your identification, credit cards, and medical records. These chips will be convenient for consumers and effective to control people. Just imagine the convenience of a cashless society where citizens will not need to carry wallets or carry any medical records. Just last month, Bill Gates suggested that digital certificates could make it possible for people to return to work safely by tracking which people have been recently tested for COVID-19 and who has received a vaccine. The government could control people by using intrusive surveillance to scan anyone unlawfully looting, even if they're wearing a mask. The microchips could identify criminals, protect assets of important people, and identify lawbreakers. We've never had a time in our history where people would be more willing to do this now than any other time. In fact, in 2018, a company in Wisconsin puts inside every single employee's hands that are willing to take it, and they don't have to have keys. They can enter the building. But I don't think that that is how the mark of the beast will actually work. In the Bible, the right hand can represent a person's actions, work, and labor. The forehead can symbolize the inner beliefs and the intellect of what is in the mind. I believe that the mark of the beast is most likely related to what you believe in your mind, what you do with your hands. Where does this idea come from? John is writing to people who knew the Old Testament. He was using language that would be very familiar to them. In the book of Revelation has 404 verses and over 500 references to the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 13, Moses is writing about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The people were to observe the feast every year and remember God's faithfulness so they could serve Him faithfully. In Exodus chapter 13, verse 19, we read this: "The observance will be for you like a sign on your hand, a reminder on your forehead, that the teaching of the Lord may be on your lips. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt by His mighty hand." Moses is talking about the feast as a sign on their foreheads, referring to their thoughts, attitudes, actions. The mark of the beast is likely referring to ownership and allegiance to this world system. Someone has the mark of the beast when their thoughts and their attitudes and their actions are hostile towards God and go against the things that He stands for. In fact, in verse 18, John tells us what our response should be. He says, "This calls for wisdom." And I don't think we need wisdom to identify the exact person, but we need wisdom to discern the tactics and the strategy of the evil one so that we may remain faithful to God. As we focus on the main characters, the second truth that is abundantly clear, and let's don't get caught so much up in the symbols that we miss it. There is a war, and you will be held accountable to which side they're on. There is a war, and you have to choose which side you're on. There is a war, and you have to choose to be accountable to, you will be held accountable to whichever side you choose. God vindicates His precious servants, and He deals with the people that reject Him. The first group receives grace and mercy, and that's what happens to the 144,000, is we get to see that their character is exemplified. You get to see that in them they have no lies. We get to see that they have not given into immorality. And then it goes on later and says, "This calls for the faithful endurance on behalf of the saints." What God calls us to do is to be faithful, and if we do, we will be rewarded. I love to see how the 144,000 get to sing a song of the redeemed. They get to sing the song of Moses and the Lamb. They get to sing of God's faithfulness. And as we end up in chapter 15, we get to see that God is just and His accountability is true and righteous. And anyone will either be judged or will get mercy. You either get grace and mercy or you get judgment and wrath, and you get to choose which one you receive. There's two sides. Which side are you on? Are you going to be with God or are you going to be against Him? Thanks for joining us on this week in the book of Revelation.